Welcome to this panel, Legislating for Animals at Every Level. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Alicia Prygoski, and I am the Strategic Legislative Affairs Manager at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. In that role, I am so lucky I get to work with an incredible team of people to pass legislation for animals at the local, state, and federal levels. We are so fortunate today to have some amazing panelists, and together we will explore the different legislative dynamics and levels of government in the United States and Canada. We'll discuss the challenges present when trying to introduce and pass legislation for animals, and how we defend against legislation that is designed to harm animals. We're also going to hear about some really incredible and inspiring victories that have positively impacted the lives of so many animals. So with that, panelists, could we just go down the line and you all can introduce yourselves?
Sure. Ledy, VanKavage, Senior Legislative Attorney at Best Friends, and I've been doing animal law exclusively for 25 years. First with the ASPCA for 9 years, and I've been with Best Friends for 16 years now.
Hi, I'm Jaime Olin. I'm here today from Dallas, Texas. I'm in private practice as an attorney. I am also the Vice President of the Board and Legislative Chair of the Texas Humane Legislation Network. Before going back to private practice, I was Legal Advocacy Counsel with the ASPCA, and I've been involved in some form of animal law or animal welfare for most of my career.
Hi, I'm Camille Labchuk. I run an organization called Animal Justice in Canada. We're kind of like the Canadian ALDF. And I got my start coming to this conference first when I was in law school in 2011 when it was at Lewis & Clark. And I think the last time I was here was 2018 before the pandemic, so it's really nice to be back. We do all kinds of animal law work, including litigation. And today we're going to be talking about some legislative work that we've done and focusing on, I think, the federal victories that we've managed to achieve in Canada.
Thank you so much, everyone. So with that, let's get started. Camille, I would like to kick it back to you, actually, to start things off. Could you talk to us about the differences between the U.S. and Canadian legislative environments?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of you are probably looking up in here and thinking, oh, those lucky Canadians, they probably have it a lot better for animals in Canada. And it is true, our national pastime is feeling morally superior to Americans. But it is not true that the situation is better for animals. In fact, it's significantly worse in a lot of ways. And I'll just give you a little lay of the land as to why. Overall, there are far fewer opportunities to introduce and pass legislation in Canada. One of the really notable differences is that we don't have access to ballot initiative processes, so there are effectively no ways to pass laws through direct democracy. There is sort of one procedure in one province where it could be feasibly possible, but realistically it's not an option for animal laws. And then the second thing is that we just pass very few laws through our legislatures compared to Americans. So, example, this is my research, and maybe some of the American attorneys can correct me, but my research suggests that in New York and California, very large productive states, about 1,000 bills per year are passed. In, say, smaller states like Illinois or Colorado, 400, 500 bills per year are passed. In Ontario and British Columbia, which are our largest provinces, 27 bills passed last year in each of those locations, 27. So there are just not that many chances to get laws before legislators. Nearly all bills that do get passed are government pieces of legislation that the government that is in power has put forward. There's much less of a bipartisan process. It tends to be that our legislatures are dominated by majority governments that implement their agendas that they ran on during elections. So the opportunities for private members or individual legislators to come put forward a bill, including on animals, and perhaps especially on animals, given how marginalized those issues are, they're just very, very low in comparison. So nearly all the laws that we do see passed are government bills. We'll come back to this later. I've got a few stories about how you can work productively with governments given that context. I'll say the one sort of difference and glimmer of hope is that at the federal level, our Senate is an interesting time and phase of its history. The Senate used to be political appointees who tended to be, they were appointed by the Prime Minister. They tended to be like party fundraisers that the Prime Minister wanted to draw a Senate salary so they could go out and raise money for the Liberal Party or the Conservative Party, so Senate bagmen. And now they're appointed by a bit less of a partisan process. They're independent individuals who apply to become senators, and they tend to be really renowned and interesting Canadians, and not just party elites. And a lot of those folks have shown an interest in animals, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. So, with few opportunities, what this means is that we often have to think big, and when we do have a chance, try to go big or go home.
Thank you so much, Camille. That is really fascinating to hear about. I think that obviously there are some similarities between the two governments, but those differences are striking. And I'm sure that, I'm excited to hear more about the strategy that you all use and what you have to do with so few opportunities. I work on federal legislation in the United States and can confirm there are so many more bills getting introduced than that. A previous Congress, one of the recent Congresses actually, which is a 2-year session, had over 10,000 bills introduced in that one Congress. So very different dynamic there. And it is, it's interesting because I feel like we almost have, it's sort of like the opposite problem where we have to learn how to cut through all the noise in a way. And try to figure out how do we keep animals top of mind, especially when you have things like the current government shutdown. Everybody is focusing on that, and they should be focusing on that in the United States. But it is challenging sometimes to try to figure out how to put animals at the forefront and how to remind our legislators that animals are important with all of these other issues. So I think it is very interesting to kind of hear about those differences, similarities, and see how with the different legislative environments, especially at those federal, national levels, we can still really work to do this. So, in addition to federal U.S. legislation, each state passes their own bills, own pieces of legislation, and this varies widely. States, obviously very different dynamics in each state, different political environments in each state, and so you're going to have different bills from state to state. So, Jaime, with each U.S. state having a slightly different legislative process, how do these differences contribute to the patchwork of animal-related legislation that we see around the country?
Sure, thank you. So there is a lot of differences among the states, as you pointed out. I'm going to be talking today mostly from the perspective of Texas because that's where I live, that's where I work. But we'll point out where some of these differences really come into play depending on what you're working on, if you need to look at a completely different state than the one you live in, the types of considerations that you need to take into account. So just to start with, like I mentioned in the introductions, I'm part of the Texas Humane Legislation Network. It's a long title. I'm going to be abbreviating it as THLN as we go along. And THLN is actually celebrating its 50-year anniversary this year. So we've been working on behalf of animal welfare in the Texas state legislature for the last 50 years. And we've been able to pass bills, really, really important bills, such as banning the use of gas chambers and shelter for euthanasia. We were integral in passing the dogfighting and cockfighting bills in the penal code. And one of the more recent victories, I'm going to talk about some more throughout the hour, but we passed a bill requiring canine encounter training for law enforcement, whereas before, law enforcement might come to a house and the instinct was to shoot the dog. And this is required training now that they are able to learn about, here's some non-lethal ways to deal with dogs when you're coming to a stop. So I want to actually talk a little bit about the legislative process in Texas and all of the considerations that go into it, knowing, of course, not everybody here is from Texas, but these are some considerations you can take back to your home states. So on the slide that you're looking at is a simplified version of the legislative process in Texas. It is long and it can be very convoluted. The Texas legislature meets every other year for about 6 months. And the legislature meets in the odd years, elections happen in the even years. So there's only about 6 months to get 2 years worth of legislation passed. And like Camille was talking about, and I was just shocked at your statistic about 27 bills, just in the state of Texas this last session, we had over 8,000 bills filed. And only about 7 out of 8 of those bills pass. And so there's a whole lot of failed legislation. And there's a lot of different reasons why a bill might not make it through. So many of those reasons have to do with the legislative process that slows everything down. A lot of that's intentional. But there's just a lot of fingers in the pudding, so to speak, to make sure that every bill is being heard by as many different legislators as possible, getting hearings, and just stepping through every single thing that needs to happen to make a bill a law in this massive state. So I also wanted to talk a little bit, and if I can have the next slide. And I'm sorry, this is so tiny. I just found this very interesting, that there are so many differences just in the makeups of all the different state legislatures. And this is just about 8 or so that I pulled from Wikipedia. Differences between, is it bicameral or unicameral? Is there one house or two? Differences in term limits for the legislators. Differences in the length of those terms that they serve, whether a filibuster is allowed. So all of those considerations are different state to state. So this, I like trivia and I like very random trivia, so I'm gonna put this question out there. What state does everyone think has the least number of legislators in the US? And you can just shout out your potential answers. I heard something over there. Okay, any other guesses? Okay. I will say I was surprised by this one. It just wasn't something that I had thought about. Anybody on the stage have any thoughts on this?
Nebraska?
Me.
That's right.
Well done, Ledy.
The answer is Nebraska. It's a unicameral legislation. I'm just going to check my notes. They have 49 legislators in Nebraska. That's it. And then I want to also ask, and I will give you a hint that the answer is not on this slide that we're looking at, which includes California, New York, and Texas. What state has the most legislators? New Hampshire. Everybody knew New Hampshire. Yeah. That's amazing. Yes, I did not know the answer to that. New Hampshire has 424 legislators. So I did the math. I'm a little bit of a nerd, and I was like, okay, given the population of New Hampshire, with 424 legislators, how many constituents per legislator does that average out to? It is 3,300 residents per legislator in that state. So I was kind of shocked by that for such a tiny state that they have that many legislators. But it really does just drive home the point of it's just so different in every state, and these are all considerations to take into account. Because if you're working at the state legislature and you have to think about how are we going to get a team to lobby on a bill that we're working on, there's a big difference between 49 legislators and 424. And so if I can have the next slide, please. The other thing we always need to take into account state by state is the political makeup of the legislature. And in Texas, for example, it has been, the last time that we had a Democratic governor was in 1994. The last time we had a Democratic majority in the Senate was 1996. And the last time we had a majority in the House for Democrats was 2002. And so when we hear about Texas being described as a deep red state, for the population demographics, that's not necessarily true, but at the Capitol, it definitely is. And that's an important thing to take into account when you're thinking about who am I going to find as an author for my bill? Who is going to be serving on this committee? Who do we need to lobby to get support on it? And what kind of political considerations do we need to take into account? All of that has to be taken into consideration depending on the political makeup of your state legislature. I really like that pie chart in the middle, though. This one showed that the vast majority of the bills that the Texas legislature passes are bipartisan in nature. And that means that you might have a Republican author in the Senate and a Democrat author in the House. You would have legislators from both parties voting in favor of a bill. And so even though what we hear in the news is always very much, well, the Republicans did this, the Democrats did this, on the vast majority of bills, everyone really is still working together. And that is especially true on animal bills. And as I'll talk about a little bit later with some of the specific bills that we've worked on, you really do have bipartisan support by and large on animal issues, especially companion animal issues, I would say. And it's something that is always a bit surprising to me that these issues really do cross party lines most of the time. And with that, I have another question for all of you, and I just want to see a show of hands. How many of you on the lock screen on your phone have a picture of an animal? Okay, so this is a project I want to do. I think if I went to the Texas Republicans meeting, they have a yearly meeting, a caucus, and I asked the same question, and then I went to the Democrats, I think the numbers would be roughly the same. I should have raised my hand too. Of course, I have a picture of my 2 dogs on my lock screen. And it just, these issues really, really cross party lines, and it's very interesting to see that a legislator that you might think, oh, this person is so deep red, they're never going to go for an animal issue, they will talk to you for 20 minutes about their dog. And so it's a really great way to get a foot in the door on these issues at the legislature.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much, Jaime. I mean, so many good points there, and could not agree more about the bipartisanship and the fact that regardless of where folks fall on the political spectrum, if you bring up a dog or you bring up a cat and kind of see what happens, I feel like more often than not, you end up having really good conversations. Everybody loves their animals. I think we know that. Most people consider animals part of their family, and that includes our legislators. Shifting gears a little bit now and taking things over to the local level, Ledy, can you talk to us about why advocates should care about local legislation?
Well, how many of you have been to a city council meeting? All right. How many of you have been to a county board meeting? Okay, that's great, that's great. Well, I encourage you all to get involved because this is where the animals are. The animals are in your cities. They are in your counties. And it's here that you can make a huge, huge difference just by being active. I mean, basically, as Tip O'Neill said back in the day, all politics is local. And so it's important for you to have a relationship with your city council members, with your county board members, because they can make a huge difference. They really can. And again, you know, Best Friends, we focus on the animals that are dying in shelters. We're trying to get the nation to no kill. Luckily, and no kill is a benchmark of 90%, saving 90% or more of the animals that come into the shelter. It's a floor, it's not a ceiling. And some shelters like Hillsborough County, Florida, are saving 99% of the animals that come in, which, you know, back when I was with the ASPCA, I toured Hillsborough, I would have never believed it, but they're doing a great job. And it's because of local involvement. I mean, it's just so crucial. So again, I encourage you to get involved in local politics. Most importantly, I encourage you to run for office. We need good people in politics. You guys, you know, you would be wonderful city council, county board members, or if you don't want to run for office, become city attorneys, because city attorneys can make such a difference in the ordinances that get passed, in the advice they give to their city council members. I mean, you can make a huge difference. Become a member of the International Municipal Lawyers Association. Best Friends has worked with them for years, getting good model legislation passed for city ordinances, and you can make a difference. So again, please get involved with your local governments, because that is where the animals are, whether it's trying to stop a factory farm, you know, from coming into your county, or basically, you know, saving the animals in your shelter. How many of you have looked at the data of what's going on in your animal shelter? How many of you know? So, a few. If you go to bestfriends.org, we have the information of all the stats of the animal shelters in the US, so you can check what your local shelter is doing and get involved. And that's what we need. We need your action.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ledy. Yes, I think the local level is really, it's so unique. It's so unique because I think that, you know, you have, as Ledy was saying, you have a level of access to your local legislators that you might not have for folks at the federal level. You know, it's really hard. Camille, I don't know how it is in Canada, but it's really hard to get a hold of your member of Congress sometimes. Most of the time it has to go through several levels of staff. And so I think that local level is really, that is impactful. So now we've kind of gone over some of the strategies, some of the differences, similarities between all of these jurisdictions in both countries at the different levels. And now let's do a little bit of a deeper dive into specific campaigns and strategy. So Camille, there were 2 federal attempts to pass ag-gag laws in Canada, and you defeated them both times, which is absolutely incredible. How did you manage to do this? Can you talk to us about that more? That deserves a round of applause.
It was awesome. Well, to go back a little bit and zoom out, the context for ag-gag laws in Canada is, unfortunately, that was an American export to Canada that we led across the border. It didn't start happening in Canada until significantly later, so the first ag-gag law was introduced in 2019, and they were introduced not specifically to combat investigations, undercover investigations, although that was included often in them, but they were more introduced to combat mass sort of farm lockdowns where activists would descend upon a farm, live stream horrifying conditions, call for law enforcement, invite the media in. There were a few situations like this, a Meet the Victims action that got quite a lot of publicity, and that was the impetus behind Canada's industry starting to push for ag-gag laws. So we had an Alberta ag-gag law that passed first. Alberta is like Texas North, so no surprise there. And then the second one was introduced in Ontario, and it passed at the height of the pandemic in June 2020, when governments were so busy, apparently, that they had little time for anything but the pandemic and ag-gag laws. So that was the context provincially. And then around that same time, we saw a bill introduced federally. And it was more focused on trespass, less so on undercover investigations, although it still could have impacted them. And the impetus behind it, so the proponents said, was biosecurity and preventing disease risks that arose when people who were not authorized to be on farms were there. So the bill was introduced as a private member's bill, actually, by a conservative member of parliament who was the agriculture critic and came from the most agriculturally focused riding probably in the country. And as I mentioned before, it's very seldom that private members' bills actually do pass because there's so few opportunities to hear legislation. And this guy actually had a really lucky slot. So there's a lottery that determines in what order MPs will get to put forward private members' bills, and he was really high up on the list. So this one actually was moving forward. And what ended up happening is the Conservatives were in opposition at that time. The Liberals were in power, but they were in a minority government position. So they needed support from opposition parties to pass legislation. And conversely, what that meant is if all the opposition parties agreed on a legislative priority, they could potentially pass something. So the Liberals in government said that they were not in favor of this bill, but the other two parties did vote for it to go to a committee for consideration. So what we did when it first got to that committee phase is we focused on the New Democratic Party, which is a socialist, progressive, left-leaning party. And it had supported the bill initially to get to a hearing because it does have some sort of rural constituencies that it caters to. And what we did, we really heavily focused on mobilizing people. So this, I think, is something that's so important for anybody doing legislative work, is not just relying on your own skills and smarts and relationships with legislators, but relying on the base, your supporters in that province, across the country, in the city or town where you're working, and getting them actively engaged as well in trying to stop a bad bill or promote a good one. So what we were able to do was have both like a very high volume of emails sent to legislators on this topic, specifically from that New Democratic Party, because at the committee hearing, they controlled the balance of power. So they sort of had a deciding vote because of the position they were in. So we had a lot of emails sent, and then we had our members meet specifically with New Democratic members of parliament in very key ridings and tell them very, very strongly in no uncertain terms why this would be bad for animals. And that message filtered up to the top. And in the end, they ended up being very good at the committee level. They called a lot of evidence that was favorable to defeating the ag-gag bill, and it was going very well. We managed to put forward an amendment to the bill so that it wouldn't just target people who were unlawfully on farms who created a biosecurity risk, but the bill would actually prohibit any conduct at a farm that created a biosecurity risk, no matter whose conduct that was. That would include farmers themselves. That would include farm workers. This was a poison pill because we all know in this room that most of the biosecurity disease risks that happen on farms, they're never from trespassers, they're from risky farm practices that the industry engages in because they want to save money. Things like sharing equipment between barns, things like having open windows when wild birds can fly in and spread bird flu, sharing needles between animals with vaccinations. So that was a poison pill for the industry, and the bill was no more. There was an election, so it was officially dead. And then lo and behold, the same guy gets another really good private member's slot in the lottery, and he comes back with the same bill. This time he'd done his homework, and he'd gotten the government on board and had the farmers lobby the government enough that they were voting for it to get to the committee phase. And so in the House of Commons, we have both a House of Commons and a Senate. the bill passed through. And this photo is from me testifying. That's the head of the CFIA, which is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency next to me. It's like the Canadian USDA. They, at this point, were supporting the bill, even though they knew it was really pretextually just an ag-gag law. We kind of thought, well, we're going to have to take the L on this one. There's probably no hope of rescuing this. But then the bill got to the Senate, and something really interesting happened. The Senate Agriculture Committee, which included many of these independent senators that I spoke of before, was really mad about the bill. They identified constitutional, jurisdictional issues. They realized it was trespass law dressed up in the federal language, and that would infringe upon provincial rights, which trespass is in Canada. And they ended up introducing that same amendment that we got passed the first time around. So again, farmers were ripping mad, the bill proponents were ripping mad, but it was a poison pill, and the bill wasn't going anywhere. Eventually there was an election, and it was dead.
Wow. There is so much strategy to unpack there, and that is really, it's amazing to just kind of see what you can do when you have a bill like that, and the creative thinking with the poison pill and working defensively. I think that is something that we see so much with animal legislation. You have your offensive bills, right? The bills that are good for animals, but this happens so frequently. As Camille noted, at the provincial level, kind of seeing that first, and then the national level, same thing happens here in the states. We see that a lot at the state level first, and then it kind of catches on and see something similar at the federal level. And so, it really is this balance of trying to pass good laws for animals, but really honing in that strategy and really figuring out how to stop these terrible bills like ag-gag. And so that is great. We love to hear the victory stories. We love to hear the good news come out of this movement. There's so much bad news that hearing stories like that of success, it's really inspiring. So, on this note of good bills and bad bills, offense and defense, Jaime, I'd like to go back to you, and it would be great if you could speak to us about really just how much time and energy must be spent on defeating bad legislation as opposed to promoting good legislation. Sort of what that dynamic has been for you at the state level.
Sure. My answer is going to be as lawyerly as I can possibly make it, which is it depends. It depends on the session. It depends on who's energized that session, and that can really, really depend on who's in power, what organizations are working the legislature at that point. But I also want to give an example, and I'm going to go through some of the good bills from the last session and then some of the bad bills that THLN was able to stop. But when we were talking a little bit about how much work can go into a bill. In 2021, we had our Safe Outdoor Dogs Act bill. That was the third session we had brought it. This included really, really important changes for outdoor dogs. It included requirements for water, shelter, the banning of certain types of tethering, and it also eliminated this notice provision that law enforcement had to deal with, which was if there was a tethered dog and law enforcement came, then they had to leave a notice on the door that said, you have 24 hours to correct this, which meant that everybody just corrected it, and then they would come back in 24 hours and the dog wasn't on the tether anymore. So it was really hamstringing law enforcement in their ability to do anything about this. So the Safe Outdoor Dogs Act was a great bill that THLN has worked for many sessions. In 2021, it passed both houses for the first time. It was very, very exciting. It was on the governor's desk. And then Governor Abbott, who had 20 days after the close of session to sign or veto bills, vetoed the bill. And it was a huge surprise. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody exactly knew why he had done it. And then 2021 was also the year that I believe we had 5 special sessions back to back. So that means that after the regular session, a special session can be called for additional bills that didn't have time or that need additional consideration. In the very last special session, Governor Abbott's office had been getting so much pushback about him vetoing this bill, including from his own wife, as we hear, that he brought the bill back in the 5th special session and it eventually passed. And so that was a huge victory that took a ton of resources that we were not necessarily thinking we were going to have to devote all the way, I think it was through September or October after session ended in May. So that's, again, just a consideration. You can't always predict what's going to happen during a session and how your resources are going to need to stack up. But just very quickly, I want to go through some good bills from this past session that really just ran out of time. Because, like I said before, this is the main thing that happens to the 8,000 bills that are filed every session in Texas, is the vast majority of them just don't have time throughout session to make it to the governor's desk. So the first one was our ethical pet sales bill, and this was a really, really good bill. We helped the bill author draft the bill language. We used every state that has passed a really good pet store ban. We used the best of all of those bills and came up with a bill that I think would have been probably one of the cleanest pet store ban bills in the country. And we had a ton of bipartisan support on this bill, like unprecedented for a bill of this nature. And unfortunately, it just ran out of time. It just didn't make it. And I just want to point out also that this bill, we had a Republican sponsor in the House and a Democratic sponsor in the Senate. And so just another example of bipartisan, really almost everyone liked this bill, but it just didn't get out in time. Same thing for our veterinarian telemedicine bill. In Texas, telemedicine for veterinarians is allowed, but you have to see a veterinarian in person before you can utilize telemedicine. So the point here was to fix the statute so that that initial visit, that veterinarian client-patient relationship, could be established by telemedicine instead of an in-person visit. And it was literally changing one word in the statute was all it was going to take. And again, this one just ran out of time. Tons of support. Again, we had a Republican author in the House and a Democratic author in the Senate. It just couldn't make it through. But we did have some good victories. For example, Texas has had an animal-friendly license plate for decades, and it was in dire need of a refresh. The application process to get the funds from this license plate is extremely long, and it's very, very complicated that most shelters just don't have the resources to even apply for those funds. And so we've been working on streamlining that process and also just updating the design of the license plate. And so that's something that we were able to get past, and that's going to be coming out pretty soon. We were also able to spearhead an effort to get criminal negligence added to the animal cruelty statute. And this was mainly because there are so many reports of dogs and cats dying at boarders and groomers, and there was really no way under the criminal statute to have liability there. And so this added that possibility. And then if we can go to the next slide, I want to talk about a couple of bad bills that we were able to defeat. So the first one here was a cultured meat bill, and I know we're seeing those all over the country that would have banned the manufacture and sale of cultured meat products in Texas. This one failed, so yay, that was great. The next one was sort of amusing to us because in 2021, we had managed to strengthen our licensed breeder bill. Basically, the Texas Department of Regulatory Matters, I'm not getting the acronym right, but there is a breeder bill that they use that says if you come under a certain number of dogs and number of puppies that you sell per year, you have to be licensed by the state, and then that enables the state to come in and do inspections. It's not perfect, but it's something, and it's certainly more than the USDA does for breeders within the state. So we managed in 2021 to get the number of breeding females and the number of puppies sold lowered significantly so that way more breeders would come under this bill, or this statute. And then there was a bill in this legislature to undo it altogether, which happens, and luckily that was defeated. There was also a bill, competing bills, one to strengthen the cockfighting statute and one to weaken the cockfighting statute, and both of those bills failed. So that's something else that when we're considering legislation in every session, we're thinking, okay, we want to bring this bill that would make something better for animals, and then you hear a rumor of, oh, there's a group coming in to do something that's gonna make things worse for animals. And so those kind of competing perspectives are really, really important at the legislature also. The last one I'll just mention very quickly was another bill that failed, and this was the most bizarre thing that I had seen this session, I think, which was it would actually ban municipalities from requiring farm animal operations to have sprinkler systems installed. So if Dallas, for example, said, okay, we're gonna require that if you have livestock, if there's a fire, you have to have a sprinkler system. And this bill said, nope, we're not gonna let municipalities do that at all. It failed, which is great. So now municipalities can make those requirements as they want to. But again, just very bizarre when you think about the number of people working on these facilities as well, and why you wouldn't want to allow for better fire protections, but that's just what we're up against in some places.
Wow, yes, thank you for going through all of those. That one in particular, it really does make you wonder sometimes. It's unfortunate what the motivation is behind some of these bills, but really glad to hear that that one failed. I think that this is also interesting, Jaime. I'm so appreciative that you've gone through all of the good bills and all of the bad bills in one session, because it just shows the wide range of animal bills that show up, and this is one state and one session. So we really do have to kind of be nimble and figure out how to work on so many different issues at one time, because there is certainly no shortage. So Ledy, I have a question for you now. We've been talking a lot about strategy and being strategic and trying to figure out how to do this and be creative. So could you give a few instances of strategic maneuvering or coalitions that you've worked with and that you've built to get legislation through?
So this is my favorite, because I view legislation as chess. So basically, the board is clear and you can figure out how to move the pieces. And it's so much fun. I mean, it really, for anybody who's not lobbied, it's really, really great fun. But for instance, back when I was with the ASPCA, I know Carrie's here from the ASPCA, I was running a bill to ban sexual contact with animals in Illinois. And basically, I was having, at the time, there was a Republican, the Senate was controlled by Republicans. And the Republican, president did not, of the Senate, didn't want anything to do with animals. But I thought, okay, how am I going to get this bill passed? So I thought, Eagle Forum, Phyllis Schlafly's group. They fought the ERA, they're very right-wing, they were connected. So I picked up the phone and I called Phyllis Schlafly's Eagle Forum and said, hey, we're trying to get a bill passed to get rid of sexual contact with animals. And my husband was appalled because he's not a fan of that group, nor am I, but they showed up. All these, little old ladies in hats showed up at the hearing and we got it done. I mean, it was pretty amazing. So, so again, coalition strategy can work. And sometimes you just want to introduce a bill to as a shot across the bow. That's kind of my favorite, because we, again, I do a lot of city work now, and we try to get trap, neuter, return for healthy cats passed in various cities. Well, the Illinois Department of Natural Resources had, something on their website saying the Department of Natural Resources opposes any feral cat, TNR programs in the state of Illinois. I mean, it was, extremely frustrating because they have no jurisdiction over cats in Illinois. It's the Department of Ag. So I talked to a leader in the Democratic Party, and I said, hey, why don't you introduce a bill that just says the Department of Agriculture may provide guidance regarding humanely reducing the community cat population in Illinois, and the second sentence was, no other department or agency has any jurisdiction over cats in Illinois. And when DNR saw that, they were like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. We don't want this bill to pass. It's like, well, take down your stupid policy, So, we're not, we won't move this bill if you get rid of your policy, but if you don't, we're gonna run it, So that's the deal. And we negotiated, and so they changed their policy that the Department of Natural Resources opposes any community cat TNR on DNR lands. So again, that they own or manage. So that's fair, So all the cities can do what they want. They don't try to fight it in the cities anymore, and it's just so helpful. So again, it's just so much fun to do this. And for coalitions, going back to cities, I'm from Southern Illinois by St. Louis, and we had a county, St. Clair County, Illinois, that was killing dogs and cats in gas chambers. And I had gotten a bill passed before that, said that if you're going to use a gas chamber, it has to be, it has to have a viewport, it has to be vented, only one animal at a time. They were not doing that. They had a barrel where they'd throw all the cats in and hook up a tractor motor and kill all the cats. I mean, it's horrific. So I went to them, at a meeting, a county meeting, and said, this is against the law. This is not legal in Illinois. You need to stop this. Totally blown off. They just blew me off. So it's like, okay, so I was a founder of Metro East Humane Society, and we worked with Belleville Humane Society, got together. We both worked, to try to get the word out to the papers, a lot of press. And so they had a county board meeting on this. And at the county board meeting, the county veterinarian had given his officers euthanasia solution. And he videotaped, he didn't give them any training, videotaped them injecting dogs with it. I mean, right into their chest. I mean, some dogs had to be injected 3 times. It was a snuff film. That's what it was. And so I got up and said, I want a copy of that Freedom of Information Act request. And that was the only meeting I've ever been thrown out of. But it was worth it because everyone was thrown out, including a lot of prominent political people. And so front page of the paper, advocates thrown out of this meeting, county board meeting. And so, the upshot was the veterinarian got a brand new gas chamber in, and he was showing it to Department of Agriculture officials. And what happened is, this was before HIPAA, but a lot of people at the hospital wanted the gas chamber gone too. And the veterinarian, when he was operating it, he forgot to vent it, and he collapsed. So they had to call an ambulance, take him to the hospital, and the nurses called the reporter and said, the county vet just collapsed because of the gas chamber. And so the reporter called me and said, I wanted to let you know this is going to be on the front page of the paper tomorrow. And so this is when we had fax machines. I got up and got the paper and I faxed it to every station in St. Louis, and they all showed up on his door at like 7 a.m. in the morning on Saturday. And then we got rid of the gas chamber. But it's stuff, like you can use media, you can, get involved. I mean, it's, there's a lot of cool things you can really do if you get active, but, get active locally. We need you.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. What a story, Ledy. Oh my goodness. But I really think that what you touched on, so much of what you touched on is so important. It is the stakeholders, the coalition building, how you mentioned the non-traditional allies. Non-traditional allies can be some of our best friends when it comes to legislation. Who can we team up with who might resonate for a legislator more than, say, one of our animal groups because they might have different interests. You mentioned media. Of course, media can also be immensely helpful in reporting these things, getting the word out to the public, increasing awareness. There's so much different strategy. The government agencies, when they have a stake in things, they tend to care when they have a stake in things. So I feel like that story and those stories and what you just talked about are a really good example at the local level of how to kind of think through the stakeholders who exist and the coalitions that you might have available to get some of this done.
And it's fun. I mean, it really is fun
and it's
thinking
like
of
chess.
it is like chess.
I like that analogy a lot. I might start using that. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit more now. Camille, I want to take things back to you. So we've been talking about the small number of animal bills and of just bills in general in Canada. So with comparatively few animal bills considered and passed in Canada, how do you manage to get action on animal legislation? Talk to us about your strategy.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to use one example, which is a toxicity testing bill or some amendments to a bill that included toxicity testing, but I'll get to that. So the way that we think about it, and I think this is a lesson that we can all take no matter what level or degree of difficulty we're working with or what volume of legislation is being passed, is like starting to plan this out very well in advance. So little federal history of Canada, not the full federal history of the country, but of animal legislation in the last decade or so, there had not been any significant changes to Canada's federal animal laws in about 100 years until 2019. And in 2019, there was a raft of animal legislation, which is great, and I think I'm going to come back to some of that later. But what I'll say is, like, the Liberal Party came into power in 2015. They were interested potentially in some of these issues. And so when we had an election in 2019, we made sure, and by we, I mean the animal protection community as a whole, not just animal justice, we made sure to reach out to that party, to reach out to the other parties, and ask them to include provisions in their platform that they would implement should they win the election. And this is something that political parties in Canada all do, is release an election platform. In the Liberal platform, they agreed to a bunch of pretty progressive things that were sort of shared priorities amongst all the groups, and things that seemed societally and, you know, from the business community realistically feasible. One of those things was to phase out toxicity tests on animals. So this is cool because obviously there's been a lot of international movement on this regard as well. So the United States has had plans to phase out toxicity testing, the EU as well, and it made sense for Canada to agree to this. And that was one of their platform commitments. We were all enthused about that. And then there came forward a bill. It was updates to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, which regulated toxic chemicals and does a variety of other things. And in the preamble of the bill, the government said, yeah, and this is after the election, of course, the government said, yeah, this is great. We aim to phase out toxicity tests. But then there was absolutely nothing in the provisions of the bill that would accomplish that. So we're kind of like, all right, this is classic government signaling that they want to do something, but not actually putting their money where their mouth is. So we had also, during the election, endorsed a number of candidates who had been good on animal issues in the past parliament, or that we knew personally cared about the issues. And so by the time we started to work on this issue, there were allies in government, in other parties. There were allies at the committees that were going to be studying this legislation as well. So what we did is we worked with members of those committees to educate them on the fact that those provisions to actually give effect to a phase out of animal testing were not in the bill, and what those amendments could look like if they were to put it forward. We spoke with the government as well to get their agreement. So, you know, if just a lone legislator puts forward amendments, but the government's not on board with it, that's probably not going to go very far. So we managed to find language that the government would agree to. We also spent a lot of time, and that's my colleague Caitlin Mitchell, our director of legal advocacy, who is brilliant. She spent a lot of time talking to industry stakeholders, Syngenta and other chemical companies that have engaged in animal testing, but to their credit, would prefer to have alternative means. And they were also supportive of including language in the bill that would do that. So in the end, there was a complicated process, but all the parties agreed, which is pretty rare when it comes to an animal issue. But with industry supporting what we were suggesting that the government and opposition parties do, we were able to neutralize that opposition. So I think to Ledy's point about seeking unlikely allies, if you can show legislators that there is a clear path, that they're not going to be opposed by anybody, that they're not going to take a lot of political heat from doing something that you want to do, then that ends up being a pretty good situation. So in the end, the bill wasn't as strong as we wanted it to, and that's, I think, another lesson that we probably all know very well, is that you have your gold standard and you shoot for the stars and you aim pretty high, and you often land more around the moon. It's a bit of a compromise. So the bill didn't end up requiring an end to toxicity tests by 2035, but it did require the government to produce a plan to end toxicity tests. So they have started on that plan. It's not as good as if we would have liked, but ultimately this is a measure that affects about 80,000 animals every year who are used in some of the most brutal, absolutely horrifying, caustic testing methods known to humankind. So anything we can do to move away from that is still a step in the right direction.
Absolutely, a huge undertaking and a huge success. I mean, I think that is such a good lesson in legislation. The bit that you mentioned about compromising. Unfortunately, we have to do that. We would love to get every single thing that we want for animals, but by doing that, you made so much success here for those animals, and set Canada on the path. And so I think that is really, that's impressive, and it's something that I think we can all take away and learn, is just kind of remember that sometimes if a compromise is going to be the thing that gets it done, we can do that, and then we can build on it, and we can do the incremental steps and keep working and keep going. But yeah, absolutely, we can just find a place to start. So that's a really incredible story. Thank you. So shifting gears again a little bit, I did want to just spend some time talking about a theme that we have seen so frequently lately here in the United States, and that is preemption. So just a quick recap on preemption, right? This is a legal principle where a higher level of government takes authority away from a lower level of government or nullifies that lower level's laws. So federal overrides state, which overrides local. I'm really simplifying here. It's a supremacy clause of the US Constitution, but that's kind of the general idea. So one of the biggest examples of this that we are facing in the US right now in terms of animal protection is the EATS Act. I know many folks in the room have heard of the EATS Act because we have been working on it for a really long time, and it is incredibly important. But this is a bill that it's been introduced in several Congresses, and the purpose of it is to nullify California's Proposition 12, which was, of course, a ballot measure that prohibited the extreme confinement of farmed animals. 2023 Supreme Court rules that Prop 12 is constitutional, it can stand. Some members of Congress did not like that, and National Pork Producers Council did not like that. So that is kind of the impetus for the EATS Act. And EATS Act would overturn Prop 12, but because of the vague and overbroad language, it would overturn so many more laws as well, hundreds more laws. And this Congress, it's kind of been rebranded and renamed a little bit, but that is something that we are still fighting at the federal level. It's one of our biggest fights. We're working with a lot of allies on that, kind of some of those allies outside the animal space, those non-traditional allies, just a long list of coalition partners who we are working to fight that. But preemption is not just at the federal level. So Jaime, I want to turn it over to you. I'm hoping you can talk to us about how statewide preemption enters the mix as it pertains to local ordinances, because this is just as concerning and just as important.
Sure, thanks. I wish I had thought to queue up the Star Wars Imperial March before I started this part of the talk, because the state preemption bill in Texas was very quickly nicknamed the Death Star bill. And if you Google it, that's what comes up. So yes, in 2023, Texas passed a very, very overarching preemption bill. And it actually preempts any local or municipal ordinances that would conflict with 11 of the Texas state statutes. And that includes the agriculture statute, business and commerce, finance, insurance, labor, natural resources, occupations, and property. So it's almost everything when you really think about it. And so this bill, of course, went through a lot of iterations as it was going through the legislature. There was really never a doubt in anyone's mind that it was going to pass in some form. What I mentioned earlier, and I kept saying about the individual bills we were talking about, is how often they run out of time. I want to circle back to that for a second, because when the governor or the lieutenant governor or somebody else with a lot of power has a bill that they are just hard-pressed to get passed, then the time doesn't really matter. The bill is going to get passed. And so that's another really important consideration when thinking about different bills that you might want to bring is there going to be enough time unless I get an extremely powerful ally behind it? So HB 2127, the Death Star bill, passed. And one of the iterations it went through was to include provisions specific to pet store sales of animals. 18 cities within the state of Texas have banned the sale of puppies in pet stores, which is incredible. That's something THLN has worked very hard behind the scenes to have happen. And many, many other cities and municipalities were gearing up to do the same thing. I know there's a lot of words on this slide. I'm really just looking at the right-hand side for now. Unfortunately, the version of the Death Star bill that passed included a provision that would eliminate the ability for any cities or municipalities within Texas to ban the sale of puppies in pet stores. It grandfathered in the existing 18, which we were very grateful for, but at the same time, it stopped all the efforts to have other cities do the same thing. And so that was a big blow, but it also got us, in a way, sort of encouraged that this seems to be saying we need a statewide ban on this, and that there might be an appetite for it given the preemption. And what preemption is really doing is saying the cities cannot do something that is not allowed by the state. So that's why we have been so focused on getting a statewide ban on the sale of puppies in pet stores, because there is no longer an ability at the local level to have that happen. So that's what ended up happening there. I want to just add one positive note on preemption, though. One of the things Texas did way before this bill was have a statewide ban on breed-specific legislation, meaning that the state of Texas, a city cannot pass a pit bull ban, for example. And I know you're clapping, me too. I'm a big lover of pit bull and bully breeds, and this is pretty huge for a state like this. So preemption is not always bad for animals. Just in the case of the Death Star bill, it really, really was. And I'm actually curious, Ledy, your perspective from a local level, how this comes into play for you.
I mean, I think it's scary, but yet, I'm torn because I love the preemption stuff. Best Friends has been able to work on getting rid of breed discrimination in a bunch of states through preemption, but yet this is so comprehensive. I mean, again, as I mentioned at the break, God bless you for lobbying in Texas, because I've only done it a few times, and I never want to do it again. In fact, my boss asked me, what do you hate about your job? And I said, Texas. I don't ever want to go there again. I don't want to lobby there. I will lobby in any state but Texas, okay? God bless you, Jaime.
Oh, goodness.
Sorry, I digress.
I mean, there are differences with different states. Something to consider, especially for folks who are looking for careers in the legislative arena. But thank you both for your perspectives on that. I mean, preemption is something we're facing. It's not going away. To your point, Jaime, it can be good, it can be bad. And I think it also speaks to the fact that we really have to be working at all of these levels of government. If we're prohibited from doing something at the local level, okay, let's do it at the state level or provincial level, or let's try to see if it's something that we would have the authority to do at the federal level. So it's just, it's a really good example, I think, of how all of the different levels of government, the interplay that happens there. Ledy, I want to turn it back over to you. So, just looking at the local level, what are some common mistakes that you see in city or county ordinances that make your work more challenging, aside from Texas?
Yeah. So I wanted to put this slide in. This is a public nuisance. This is obviously a hoarder case that Best Friends worked on years ago. I don't know if Russ Mead's in the audience, but I think he worked on this way before in Pahrump. But basically, what we see is people, think that if a cat crosses their yard, it's a nuisance. If a dog runs across their yard, it's a nuisance. If a dog barks for 5 minutes, it's a nuisance. And basically, cities, when they enact ordinances like taking out parking meters, they don't consider the fiscal impact, but yet they'll pass these idiotic animal ordinances that have a huge fiscal impact, and they don't even consider it. So again, most places now are going to not allow their animal field services folks to investigate private nuisances. If it's neighbor versus neighbor, that's a civil matter. You take it up on your own. But if it's 2 or more unrelated households within like 500 feet or 1,000 feet, then okay, they'll send somebody out and investigate. And that's a good fiscal response. I mean, that's what you want. The other thing that drives me nuts is, again, I was a zoology major before I went to law school at St. Louis U, so I'm very concerned about different species. A lot of city attorneys will just write an animal ordinance, and it'll include any animal other than man. And so it's like, so if you've had an animal on your property for 3 days, you were the owner. So you're the owner of every squirrel, every rabbit, every bird. I mean, come on, that's nuts. Or, ban the feeding of, any animal. And it's any stray animal. So that includes birds too? I mean, it's crazy. So they need to be more specific, because when you go to the grocery store, there's dog food and cat food and bird food. There's just not animal food. It's nuts to me that attorneys don't think about this, but it's because there was an animal law. There wasn't, people saying, hey, wait a minute, we need to think about the ramifications of what you were writing and what they are doing. So again, it's these things. And again, get rid of pet limits. They are stupid. People say, well, they'll help against hoarding. They don't help against hoarding. Nuisance laws help against hoarding. But pet limits, do you really want your animal services officer to go up to people's doors and say, do you have 4 cats? You know, I mean, I'm confiscating one. I mean, what does that do? That's crazy. And bring it back to the shelter where every animal that comes into a shelter, it costs about $500. If you are able to keep the animal in its home, it's about $100. So cities are wasting money by passing these idiotic ordinances. And as attorneys, we need to look at our city ordinances and get them changed. And again, if anybody wants, the International Municipal Lawyers Association has a great book on, their website, People, Pets, and Policies. It's free. You can download it. Email me, I can get it to you. But basically, we're trying to get good, fiscally responsible, and humane, compassionate ordinances passed.
Absolutely, yes. And Ledy, I think you touched on a couple of things that are really important with legislation, and one is the drafting of the legislation. I agree with you. It is a kind of a wild experience to do a state-to-state comparison of the definition of animal in all the cruelty codes. I mean, just how much it can differ from state to state. And it is so important. Drafting legislation is such a key piece of it because unfortunately once something passes, it's difficult to go back and fix it or make the language different. So yes, I'm really glad that you brought that up. And the other is fiscal impact. That's something that matters as well, the fiscal impact. That can be make or break for a piece of legislation. And so I think that is something to consider also at all different levels of government. So I want to take things over to Camille again. Could you tell us the story of how you helped pass Canada's national ban on whale and dolphin captivity and breeding, which is the first new federal animal protection laws in over 100 years. Again, really exciting news out of Canada.
Well, it was a little depressing that there was a 100-year period where nothing federally was passed, but we're trying to make up for it now. There had been a few attempts, sort of in the early 2000s, to pass animal cruelty legislation that essentially tightened up criminal code offenses around cruelty and moved us from a situation where we had laws drafted in the 50s into the modern era. So it was all failed because industry came out, the experimenters, the farmers, the hunters, the fishers, and they said, it's going to shut us down, it's going to shut us down. So it wouldn't, of course, have shut them down. But we were in this phase in the early 2000s up into about 2015 where everyone felt very pessimistic and dismal about the prospects of doing anything federally because of those defeats of really basic laws that just tightened up cruelty codes. Along comes 2015. I mentioned previously that a new government was elected at that time. That's when we saw the changes to the Senate too, and it becoming a more independent institution. It became an institution where legislation could be more easily introduced. And so we've seen that as a theme through a lot of the successes that we've seen in Canada, is that those laws often started in the Senate. In this case, there was a senator from a province called Nova Scotia on Canada's east coast named Willie Moore, and his son saw blackfish one day, and his son was like, Dad, do something about this. And Willie watched blackfish too, and he was like, yeah, I think I will. So he put forward a legislation independent of pressure from animal protection organizations, a bill that would have outlawed the keeping of whales in captivity in the future, breeding of ones who were already in tanks, display in performance type situations, so animals jumping through the air to the tunes of Mambo No. 5, and also the export of whales to other captive situations unless it was in their best interest. And of course, the whales that were already in tanks, there were just 2 facilities left at this point, Marineland in Niagara Falls and Vancouver Aquarium in Vancouver. They wouldn't be allowed to export whales unless it was in their best interests. So the bill was fiercely opposed by the aquarium industry. Only 2 places left, and I think that's another lesson I spoke about earlier, trying to choose an issue where your opposition is not going to overwhelm you, and this was one of those issues. So 2 aquariums did not have the lobby power. 2 aquariums especially who had very poor reputations and had been investigated by media and advocates for many years, they did not have the power that the animal advocacy movement had, which is a pretty rare situation when you're going after an industry, right? Usually it's them that have infinite resources, and on our side of things, there's just a few of us pushing really hard. So the bill was fiercely opposed by them nonetheless, and it actually, I think, still holds the record as the piece of legislation that took the longest ever in Canadian history to pass. It was introduced like almost on the first day of the legislative session in 2015, and 4 years later, it passed basically on the last possible day with much drama. One thing that, lessons I keep coming back to is the importance of mobilizing. So there were multiple points where this one particular senator who really had, hatred for all things good. He's opposed women's rights, trans rights, indigenous rights, of course, animal rights. And had quite a lot of authority in the Senate because his position was the opposition whip. He was a conservative senator. He was able to stall the bill in the Senate for literal years because of procedural maneuvers. And at one point, he was set to kill the bill quietly behind closed doors at the committee meeting. But we caught wind of this, mobilized the public. People were so outraged, sent so many emails to senators that the Senate email server crashed. Not once, but twice. And so you can guess that they started to pay attention to this thing that the public was so riled up against. After that. So getting the public on board was really important. Getting media exposure for the issues was also really important. Animal protection issues in federal politics don't tend to be well covered. Our media landscape, and we heard from some great journalists previously, our media landscape in Canada is even thinner than in the States. Everyone knows media has been closing because of changes in the industry and changes in society. But we did have one really dogged reporter who worked for a great outlet that covered every single stage of the bill, and that didn't let senators get away with some of the shenanigans. And eventually we managed to get the government on board as well, and again, that was thanks to all the mobilizing work. They saw that people really cared about this issue, and they knew for them it would be a political liability if the session of Parliament ended and the bill hadn't passed. So thankfully it did pass, and then fast forward today, Marineland is the last place that still has whales. Vancouver Aquarium is done with theirs. Marineland is closing. There's still 30 belugas left there that you might have heard about in the news, because Marineland is now threatening to kill them if they don't get federal funding to care for them. It's essentially an attempt at extortion for public funding. And so now we're working on brokering a deal to send as many of them as possible to sanctuaries. So almost at the end of this very long issue.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Camille. I feel like every one of these bills that all of you were talking about, we learn a little bit more. Lessons learned, strategy, and that's really interesting. Thank you. Jaime, turning things over to you. How does a statewide organization like THLN decide on legislative priorities for each session, especially when there's so much out there like we have seen?
Yes. So I want to go back to, Ledy was talking about how difficult it is to pass good animal welfare legislation in Texas, and it is. It's difficult in any state. There's a lot of roadblocks in the legislative process in Texas that makes it particularly difficult in many instances. But just to share a personal anecdote quickly, when I was in graduate school and I did the Tufts University Masters of Animals and Public Policy, I did my first exposure to the legislative process ever was doing a project about the recent at that time, ban on greyhound racing or gambling associated with greyhound racing in the state of Nevada. And that happened in the late 90s. And so whenever we're up against really, really difficult opposition on our bills in Texas, I just think to myself, if they could ban a form of gambling in Nevada, we can do something good for animals in Texas. And so that's always my touchstone there. So I just want to go quickly through some of the considerations that we use when we are considering a bill that either we're going to take lead on or that we're going to partner with other organizations, and also deciding are we going to support, oppose, or be neutral on one of the many hundreds of animal-related bills that are filed every session. And some of those considerations, of course, include how many and what types of animals are going to be impacted by this legislation. Never lose the forest for the trees. You never lose the legislation for the animals. You want to make sure you're really thinking about that. But on the other side of that is how many people are going to be impacted by this bill. Because it's very, very important, and in a state like Texas, maybe more important than others, to point out this is going to have a positive impact on people, whether it's homeowners or consumers or something else. If we can frame the bill as this is not an animal bill, this is actually a bill that's going to help people, and incidentally, maybe it's going to help animals too, that is a very effective strategy that we can use in legislatures like ours. Also, is there a proven need for the bill? One of the things, and I've testified at the Capitol many times, and I actually want to ask, how many of you have testified at your state capitals on animal bills? Yeah, so it's a great experience to have. It's actually kind of great to get grilled by the legislators and hear what are they worried about. And so for these types of bills, it's really important in Texas that you make sure you show that there's a connection to Texas, and that it's not just a bill that, oh, in other states they've passed this, it's been good for animals. You have to show this is going to have a really important impact on people and animals in the state. You also want to think about who's the opposition and how strong they are. One of the main reasons, and anyone in this room who works on puppy mills or pet store legislation knows this is true, the pet store lobby is very, very powerful. And they are able to kill a lot of bills across a lot of states. And so you just want to think about who's our opposition here, how many resources are we going to have to devote to fighting them. And then one of the other things, there's a lot, but I'm just going to go into one or two more. Do we have a strong author in both houses? And this is a political consideration, but it's very important in states where politics drives everything. Because if you have a bill author and they love your bill and they're ready to do it, but they're persona non grata to most of the rest of the legislature for whatever reason, there's just always a lot of drama at the legislature, I think, at any state. They're not going to be able to pass your bill, and it doesn't matter how good the bill is. And then messaging. Messaging on bills to your donor base, to advocates, to volunteers is really important too. You need to be able to explain the bill in a way that people understand why it's important, why it should pass. The one example I'll use is on the licensed breeder bill that we talked about. This came about because the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation was being sunsetted. And everything that came within that agency's purview was being reconsidered, and that included our licensed breeder bill. So explaining to non-lawyers what sunset provisions are and how those work, and why is an entire agency in danger of just being disbanded every 10 years or so, that was difficult. And that was something I had those conversations over and over during that session to try to simplify that concept and make sure it wasn't just full of legalese. And so that's something that all of us who are attorneys or who work in the law in any capacity always need to be aware of, to not get lost in the legalese and make sure we're bringing it back to real world problems and solutions.
Thank you, Jaime. So many good considerations there. Absolutely, yes. So we are running a little short on time, but I did want to just ask you, Ledy, one more question. Sure. If you could give some advice in the last minute that we have here. How do you start lobbying on a local level? How can we all get started?
Again, communication is everything. Show up. Go to your city council meeting, your county board meeting, and gather intelligence. See who the mover and shakers are there, and then, approach them. Set up a meeting with them and talk to them about the issue. Have good talking points. Think about when we were trying, if you could change the slide. When we were talking about, I just like this, but when we were talking about, getting rid of pound seizure in Madison County, we, decided we weren't going to talk about them as stray animals. We were going to talk about them as pets. So, so again, communicate, have good talking points, know your research, reach out to folks. But, and I know people don't like to hear this, emails are great, but pick up the phone. I mean, if you go to city council meetings, most of the folks are like my age or older, and they don't check their emails. They might have Hotmail accounts, So do not think that they're going to get back to you if you email them. Pick up the phone, go there. When we were fighting pound seizure in Madison County and we were successful, I had never gone to a city council meeting, our county board meeting before, but we were able to we would go to people's houses, their neighbors, we found out where they lived, and we'd talk to them and say, hey, do you know the county's making money selling animals for research? And they were like, no. So we hit their neighbors. We found out where who their barbers were. We went and talked to their barbers so they would, when they were sitting there. So, and we showed up in front of the supermarkets and got petitions, signed. So again, you can do this, but you need to communicate. You need to be respectful. But most of all, my favorite saying, politics is not a spectator sport. So in other words, get off your butts and go to the city council meetings. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right, Our panelists had so many good things to say that we don't have time, unfortunately, for Q&A. We will all be here. I'm sure we would love to chat with folks who did have questions, but we are now going to break for lunch, and we will get started again in this room at 1 p.m. Thanks, everybody.